In this video, we're going to set up a Redis data store in our microservices application. So there's two real ways you can use Redis. You can use it as an in-memory data store or a persistent data store. So we're going to be using it as a persistent data store. So caching in general, or in-memory caching, is essentially if you have an API request, it hits the database and you hit that API request again, rather than making that database operation again, we save that resource or that network bandwidth by giving back the information or the data or the JSON object that's already cached in memory. But for our microservices application, there's some limitations to this approach. So the limitations of this approach is that essentially we've only got one server. Because we're using a social media application, we're expecting huge volumes of messages, which we're going to store in the Redis data persistence, and it means it's not scalable. So we're going to use a data store because that can be offloaded to its own service, its own microservice, and then we can obviously scale that. So it's very horizontally scalable. And the reason we're using Redis as a data store opposed to just our regular Postgres database is a Postgres database. It's really good for standard information like user information and other relational information. But the issue with a social media application is, well, in theory, if people are using your application, you're gonna have millions of people using it. You're gonna have millions of messages, or hundreds of millions or billions of messages. And you can't have all of that in just one server. So the other thing is we're going to be using the Redis in multiple servers. So we're gonna use it in online presence, chat, calls. So we're also gonna set up some dynamic modules in NestJS to be able to use it from a shared library. So some of the other benefits are a key value storage such as Redis. It's really fast because we're going to need to do things like we're going to access our previous messages, and Redis shines for its quick speed to access that, in contrast to something like a relational database, which really struggles with very large volume long tail information that we need. So for those reasons, we're going to be using Redis as a data store, and we're going to set that up in our microservice application. Let's get the Redis data store into our microservices application. So we can start off by installing our dependencies by running npm I for install. And then we'll get the cache manager, Redis, and the cache manager Redis yet. Now, if you look at the NestJS documentation, you can see that it uses the Redis store from the cache manager Redis store. However, in the newest versions of the library, there's some TypeScript issues when you're trying to access the store, and then it sort of doesn't let you do it. So rather than using a mismatch between the old version of this and the other versions of Redis and stuff like that, the workaround, what I've researched, is basically using this cache manager Redis yet package, which allows you to do so. So possibly in the future, this package will get updated with the correct TypeScript and interfaces and stuff like that. So unless you want to degrade to an older version and deal with any mismatch issues, for the time being, let's just go ahead and use this cache manager Redis yet. So let's just go back into Visual Studio Code here, and let's just start to see what we need. So in addition to the cache manager Redis and cache manager Redis yet, we can go ahead and for the cache manager, we can install as a dev dependency the cache manager types there. So that's all we need to do for our dependencies. So let's think about how we can set this up. So we want Redis, and we potentially want it in multiple services, in multiple microservices. I'm going to start off by putting it into the online presence service. But we want to do this in the shared library so then we can use it in the other services. And for the actual Redis, because we're using it as a data store, like we're storing messages in it, and we want to retrieve those at a later date, you know, we want to actually have some persistence and not just use this as just cache. But we're using it because it has a faster read write and it's more appropriate for a social media chat application compared to the overhead of something like, you know, the regular relational database or something like that. So that's why we're using Redis in addition to Postgres. And it also allows you to, you know, do some quick caching for other things. So we're going to see that in the next video. So basically, we come to the Docker Compose file in the root of our folder structure, and we can get the Redis service here, and we can use the default Redis image from Docker Hub. And the port for Redis by default is 6379. So we just go ahead and map that to our local machine from the container. And then we go ahead and we set our environment variables. So we're just using these global.env file, which is also in the root. So if we just come here, we'll see that we have a Redis pass, which is just says the password here. And then we have the Redis URI, which we'll use to connect through our node application. So it's just redis.// Now they use the default for the default user if a user is not specified, but you can secure it with the password. So I just have this variable here, which refers to this password here. Of course, you'd want to make that a little more secure. And then at Redis and the port number, which we got is 6379 here. So those environment variables are all we need. So if we return back to our Docker Compose file, another thing we want to do is, because we want to persist the data, we want to have a named volume. So in a similar way to how we have the Postgres database, we're going to have the Redis stuff in here. So we have the ./redis/data folder here that we're mapping from our system, our local machine. And if you look at the documentation, it's in the data folder in the container itself. So because we have a password, now if you look at the Postgres connection, you know, it has the environment stuff in the environment file, and you make the connection. But with the Redis, when you're in the Docker container, essentially, and let's see if there's any other commands here. Oh yeah, so there's this command here to run the start dev. Now you can just run that from the container, but in this case here, you might be familiar with using, you know, variables. If you're just using regular Docker, for example, and you want to enter the shell. So that's why we have this /bin /sh here, because from the shell rather than the terminal, we want to, you know, have this Redis server, you know, command which we have access to from within the Redis container, in which we can have this flag here to require the password. So, you know, when this runs the Redis server, it's expecting a password. And then in here, we can have this $$ to access the environment variable. So Redis pass is what we set up in the environment variables. So that will just mean, so when we open our, you know, when the server runs, you need a password to connect to that and to just adds an extra layer of security there. So the final thing we'll do here is we're just going to experiment by using it in the present server. So in that particular service, we'll see getting and setting some object data and seeing that the cache actually works. So that's pretty much the setup for Docker and the environment variables. Let's take a look at setting up the Redis module. So again, if I just collapse this and just reopen this, one thing I've done is I've just created these folders here. So there was some files in the root. So there was some modules and services and stuff like that. I just created some folders here and clicked and dragged them and clicked the update to update auto. Of course, you can pull the repo as well, but it's pretty trivial. But essentially in this modules folder in the shared library, I've created this Redis module. So the Redis module is just the Redis module with the module annotation. And what we want to do is we want to have some sort of dynamic import because we want to import this into the presence module, but we also want to import into other modules. So rather than repeat that code in a similar way to a previous video that we've set up, we can just go ahead and set this up. So the actual, there's a sort of interaction between the cache and the Redis. So the cache module is what NestJS provides you. And then so you can, there's actually caching out of the box if you just use the standard NestJS, stuff. But if you want to do more advanced stuff like have persistent storage or other types of operations like deleting things and stuff like that, you want to have more control over things. So you need to implement like a caching or data persistence technology such as Redis, which sort of sits over the top and works together with that. So we'll see how they work together. So basically, we want to use the cache module, and then we want to register an sync. We call that method. So when we import this module into another module, that will just register this. And then we have this use factory here. It needs the config service because we need to use the configuration, the environment variables to connect to the Redis database. And consequently, to use the config service, we need to inject the config service. So we can go ahead and we can import the Redis store from Cache Manager Redis Yet. And then with what we're returning here is this object here, and it has this store attached as one of the properties. And this is an asynchronous operation because you need to await for the Redis store connection. So we have the URL, and then we can just use the config service to get the Redis URI from the environment variables. Now this TTL, in the later versions, they use milliseconds. I think in older versions they used seconds. So you just need to look at which package you're using and which one is what you need. I think 5 seconds is the default, or 5,000 milliseconds. And of course you can sort of overwrite this or, change this on a case-by-case basis. But I'm using 5 seconds just so I can easily display at the end of the video the caching functionality actually working. And then we set is global to true, because if we don't have is global to true, when we import into the module, in the presence module, we want to access that in the whole the presence area, or the service. So in the controllers and all that sort of stuff, we don't want to inject it each time. We can just reference it. So we set it to global. We want to get the Redis service, which we're going to create. And that's just going to expose some methods here. So we can just have in this module, this Redis module that we're going to import, we can include the Redis service, and we can also just go ahead and export that so we can consume that service in the other modules. So if we take a look at the Redis service, it's actually pretty basic. So this is just a regular service you'll see. And there's just some imports here. Now you have to inject it, and you have to use this cache manager, constant, which comes from NestJS common. And then you just have this, this sort of caching service, which is based on the type cache. And it's important that you import this from cache manager, because otherwise it will interfere with the regular cache, which is a different type. And then we can just go ahead and expose the properties. So, Redis is a key value store, so you can, get, so it's sort of like local storage. You get something based on a key, or you set something based on a key and a value. So when you're getting something, you just go ahead and get it. And it's an asynchronous operation because you need to get it from, it's really quick. It's typically O of 1. But, depending on, how complicated things are, and your use case, the time complexity might vary a little. But, way quicker than regular databases. And it's pretty much as good as it's going to get. So we're going to expose this get method. And then based on this Redis service here, for the cache, we can access that, and then there's a get method, and then we can just get something by the key. Similarly, with set, you set the key to a value. We don't know what the value is. It could be a number, string, object, whatever. Redis handles setting that. And then we just go ahead and get that key, or we set the key and the value that corresponds with that key. And then this last operation, there's more operations, but these are just the simple ones, is deleting the key. And that's just a del. So, pretty basic stuff. And then it's just important to remember that we want to use this in the presence module. So we just need to import that Redis module. And then if we come to our presence controller, one thing that you'll note here is, the first thing you'll note is what we want to do is we just want to test our caching's working. So we just have some basic method here. So I'm in the get presence command here. One addition you'll see here is that I've got this annotation use interceptors for the cache interceptor, and the cache interceptor is coming from nest.js. So basically we've set up our caching and we're using Redis. So whenever we cache things, the Redis will be, the particular technology used for our caching, and that's just going to work. And we'll prove that in a second. So essentially, we have this cache interceptor. So this particular method will cache. So that means essentially, if you make a API call multiple times and you have something in the cache, you can essentially get that. So if you make a second request, you don't have to make a database call, and then you just get the information back. So essentially what I'm doing here is, first thing is I'm getting this foo. So foo is just like some placeholder method here. So I just got a service here that we're injecting into the presence controller, and it's going to call this service if there's nothing in the cache. So I've got this console log to see not cached, and it just returns a simple object with the key foo and bar as the string, as the value. So essentially, this would be a asynchronous operation, but technically it's not at the moment. But we will make it one shortly. So this await is redundant at the moment, but we'll be quickly adding that in the next video. So you just inject the Redis service so we can access those Redis operations. And what we can do is when we get foo, what we can do is we can just set for the key foo, for example, and we can just set that object there. And then what we can do is we can have another variable. So I've just got this foo as well, a bit of overloading, but obviously it's just temporary. So this is going to call the Redis service, and then we're going to get foo. Now, it might not be in there in the first place. So if it is there, we can say that it's cache, and then we can simply return the value. Otherwise, we just go ahead and return things here. So let's just go ahead and save that. So let's see if all that works. So yeah, let's open Postman up. So we can see that I've got foo and bar back, and then I'll click it again and click it again. Now there's no actual data operations happening, so it's all happening really quick anyway. But if we return to Visual Studio Code and we open up our Docker terminal, we can see that when we make the API call, when we make the API call, in the first place, we need to get foo from Redis. We see that it's not cached. So because it's not cached, we need to set get foo from Redis, and then we made another API call, so we get it, and then it's cached, so it's not actually hidden that again. And likewise, and because I waited 5 seconds, you see this not cached again. So let's just see this. I'm going to click this 3 times, or 2 times quick, and then I'm going to wait 5 seconds. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the 3rd time it should be reset. So we can see that we get it, not cached, cached, not cached. So that's great. Now we've set up the Redis data store, and we've got ability to cache things quickly. It's going to come in handy for the next video, which is going to be about online presence, because there's going to be lots of data associated with a user and a user's friends, and if they're connected, it's also going to come in handy for the chat messages. So it's great we set that up. So yeah, please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and we'll do the hybrid microservices in the next video. Cheers.